They came in the still season, when the heat sat on Coldwater like a flat hand and the dust didn't move and even the dogs gave up barking. That was the first thing the old hands taught the young ones, before they taught them to shoot or to ration water or to read a sky. When the air goes dead and the brass haze sits low over the ridges, you keep close to the lamps, you keep the children counted, and you do not go up into the high rocks alone. Not for a strayed animal, not for a lost tool. Not for anything. I'd been on Coldwater 11 years by then. I came out to the rim the way most of us did, which is to say running from something with the word peace stitched into the lie of it. Before the rim, I'd carried a rifle, and before I carried a rifle, I'd carried other men's blood on my hands in field tents that smelled of copper and burned plastic. And somewhere in the middle of all that I made a decision that I would spend whatever I had left putting people back together instead of taking them apart. So when the Homestead Council asked what I did, I said I was a doctor, and I let the rest stay buried under the floorboards with my old kit and the dog tags I never wore. They called me Doc. Most of them never learned my given name was August, and the ones who did used it only at funerals. There were 140 of us spread across the basin, hard people farming hard ground, and I was the only thing standing between them and the long dark when their bodies failed. I set bones. I cut out what had to come out. I sat with the dying and lied to them gently when lying was the kindness. It was a good life. I want that on the record before any of the rest of it. It was a good life, and I'd have died in it happy, an old man in a chair, if the sky had only stayed empty. But the sky over the rim was never empty for long. We knew that too. We had a word for what came down in the still season, and the word was hunters, and we said it the way you'd say a kind of weather. Nobody had ever gotten a clean look at one and lived to draw it. What we had instead was a folklore stitched out of the dead. We knew they came down out of the brass haze in something that burned the air green going through it. We knew they walked upright, taller than a tall man, and that when they wanted to they could fold the light around themselves so all you saw was a wrongness in the heat shimmer, a thing the eye slid off of, a ghost. We knew they could see the warmth coming off your body in the pitch dark, which meant the night was theirs and not ours. We knew they took trophies. The ones we found out in the rocks afterward had been opened in ways that weren't butchery and weren't malice, just craft, the spine taken whole, the skull taken clean, the rest left for the scavenger lizards as if the meat had never been the point. We called them ghosts, and we called them hunters, and old Marsh, who'd lost a brother to them in his first season, called them the long men, because of the height and because of how long the dying took. What we did not know then was that they had a law. The girl was Junie Akafer. I'd brought her into the world myself, 8 years before, in a sandstorm so thick we'd had to seal the surgery and run the lamps off the backup cells, and her mother Tessa had gripped my forearm hard enough to leave a bruise that lasted a week, and when the squalling started Tessa wept and called the baby a stubborn little thing, which she was and which she stayed. Junie was the kind of child who talked to anything. Lizards, the wind. Me, when I was elbow-deep in something and had no business being interrupted. She had a gap in her front teeth and a habit of standing too close when she asked questions, and she was, in the small accounting of a small place, beloved. It was the third day of the still season when it happened. The haze had come down the night before, that low brass ceiling, and we'd done what we always did, counted the children and trimmed the lamps and told ourselves the ridges were empty. But a settlement isn't a fist. It's a hand with the fingers spread, and you cannot close all of it at once. Junie went out past the cistern after a runaway goat, 8 years old and stubborn and certain, the way they are, that nothing in the world would dare touch her. I was suturing a man's hand in the surgery when I heard the screaming start, and it was the particular pitch of a child's terror, which a body never forgets once it's heard it, and I had my kit on my shoulder and was through the door before I'd decided to move. I want to tell this part plainly because I've heard it told other ways since, told big, told like a battle. It wasn't a battle. It was a mistake, and the mistake was not ours. Up in the low rocks past the cistern there was a shape in the heat shimmer, a wrongness, a ghost. and below it on the stone was Junie, and the blood coming off her was bright and there was too much of it. Her right arm was open from shoulder to elbow, a clean deep stroke, the kind of cut a man could not make with any blade we owned, and her face was the gray of someone the body has already started to give up on. I got my hands on her. I packed the wound and got the pressure on, and I was shouting for Marsh and for Tessa and for anyone with legs. And the whole time the wrongness and the shimmer stood over us and did not move and did not finish it. That was the thing I couldn't put together, kneeling in Junie's blood with my heart going like a hammer. A hunter does not wound. We knew that much from the dead. They struck once and they struck final and they took what they came for. This one had cut a child and then stopped, and was standing there in the heat haze like a man who has done a thing he cannot take back and does not understand. Then the haze fed it. I will never forget that. The shimmer thickened and gathered and seemed to pour into the shape from all directions, and the ghost stopped being a ghost and stood there in the brass light fully seen, and it was young. I treated enough of the dying to know youth when I saw it, even in a thing that wasn't ours. It was tall, taller than me, but there was a thinness to it, a not yet finished look, the way a yearling colt is all legs and no weight. Its skin was the mottled green-brown of the rocks, slick-looking, and its face, I'll do my best, its face came apart at the bottom into 4 moving parts around a mouth, and above that mouth were 2 eyes that were not like ours and were nonetheless unmistakably frightened. It had a blade slung off one forearm still wet with my Junie's blood, and a shoulder it carried wrong, hunched, and it was making a sound, a low broken clicking, over and over, and I understood without any way of understanding that it was the sound of something realizing the size of its error. We backed off down the slope, all of us, with Junie. The young hunter did not follow. The last I saw of it that day, it had sunk down onto the rock with its long arms around its knees, and the clicking went on, and it looked for all the world like a child who has broken a thing it loved and is waiting to be punished. Junie did not die. I will say that now so you can breathe, the way I couldn't breathe for the 11 hours I worked on her. The arm was the worst of it, and the blood loss, and the shock. I had her on the table under every lamp we owned, and Tessa holding the light and old Marsh holding the girl's good hand, and the whole settlement standing in the dark outside the surgery the way they do when one of the small ones is being fought over. I did everything I knew. I clamped what was spurting and tied off what I could and packed the rest, and when the field clotting agent ran low, I improvised the way you learn to improvise when the supply drops stop coming, with honey and pressure and a steady hand, and a great deal of swearing under my breath in a language Tessa pretended not to know I still used. The cut had gone deep along the bone, but it had missed the great vessel by the width of a thumbnail, and I have thanked that thumbnail's width every day since, because a hair to the inside and there would have been nothing on that table for me to save, only a thing to grieve. The wound was clean. That was the strange mercy buried inside the horror of it. Whatever had cut her had cut clean, the way a surgeon cuts, not the ragged tear of a beast. I did not understand that then. I filed it away with the other thing I didn't understand, the way it had stopped, the way it had stood frozen over her instead of finishing, and I kept my hands moving. I'd done it on men twice her size in worse conditions and lost them anyway. But the body of a stubborn child has a will in it that a grown man sometimes lacks. And somewhere around the 10th hour her color came back and her pulse steadied, and she swam up out of the dark and asked me, in a small cracked voice, whether the goat was all right. I laughed, God help me. I sat there with her blood drying to my elbows, and I laughed until it turned into something else, and Tessa held me, and outside the people heard it and knew, and the sound that went through Coldwater then was the sound of a held breath let go. For 1 hour I let myself believe the worst was over. I am a particular kind of fool, the kind who has seen enough to know the universe owes him no clean ending and lets himself forget it anyway, just for an hour, because his hands ache and a child is going to live. Then Tessa asked me where Daniel was, and the hour ended. Junie's father had not been in the surgery, and he had not been in the crowd holding its breath in the dark outside it. Daniel Ackaffer was a fence builder, broad and quiet and slow to anger, and I have come to believe the slow ones are the worst when it finally comes, because it has had so far to travel. Somewhere in the long hours while I fought for his daughter on the table, he had walked home and taken down the rifle he kept for the lizards and gone out past the cistern and up into the high rocks alone, in the dead heat in the dark, to find the thing that had opened his girl from shoulder to elbow and put a slug in it. Marsh told me after, gray in the face, that he'd caught Daniel's arm at the wall and Daniel had looked through him like he was made of glass. I would like to believe I'd have stopped him. I was elbow deep in the reason he was going. By the time I came up out of that work like a man surfacing from deep water, Daniel had been gone the better part of the night, and we all knew what that meant and nobody would say it. You do not go up into the rocks in the still season. You do not, for any reason, go alone. He knew it better than any of us. He went anyway, because that is what a certain kind of love does to a certain kind of man. And I have never once in all the years since been able to find it in me to call him a fool for it. We could not go after him. That was the cruelty of it. To climb up into those rocks in the dark would have been to feed the ghosts a second course, and I stood at the wall with Marsh and the others and would not let one more soul past it, and listened to the still air and heard nothing, which was worse than anything. A settlement is a hand with the fingers spread. We had lost one finger to the dark already, and there was nothing to do but close the rest and wait for the sun. The sun did not help. Daniel did not come down with it, and the next night they came. Not one ghost in the haze, many. We never had a true count because you cannot count a thing you cannot see, but the dogs went mad all at once and then went silent all at once, and the lamps along the east wall died as if a hand had passed over them, and out in the dark there was a clicking that was not the young one's broken stammer. This was deeper, layered. It came from 6 directions, and it had the rhythm of speech, of argument, of judgment being passed, and the hair stood up on my arms in a way no cold ever caused. I went out to the wall with my old rifle, which I had not fired in 11 years, and Marsh came with his, and 4 others, and we stood there in the dead heat staring into a dark full of warmth-seeing eyes that could have killed us before we'd raised the barrels. They didn't. I had stood on a great many bad lines in my first life. I'd held a perimeter while the dark filled up with men who meant to come through it, and I knew the particular taste the mouth gets, copper and ash, when the body understands it may not see morning. This was worse than any of it, and I'll tell you why. On the old lines I could see what I was afraid of. Here there was nothing to point a rifle at, only that layered clicking moving in the black and the certain knowledge that a dozen things which could open a grown man like an envelope were standing close enough to touch and choosing, for reasons of their own, not to. Beside me, a boy named Eccles, 19 and shaking, brought his rifle up at a sound out in the dark, and I put my hand flat on the barrel and pushed it down slow, and said his name until his eyes came back to me. If one of us had fired that night, I believe none of us would have seen the sun. They were not there to fight us. I understood that the way you understand the weather is about to turn. They were there for something else, and the only road through the night ran straight through letting them have it, whatever it was, and finding out in the morning what we had survived. They wanted something else, and after a while we understood what, because the young one was driven out of the rocks and into the open ground before our wall, stumbling, hurted, and behind it came a shape that did not bother to hide. This one was old. I can't tell you how I knew, the same way you can't always say how you know a stranger across a room has buried children. It was huge, broad through the chest where the young one was thin, and its hide was scarred to the texture of old bark, and the trophies hung on it were not lizard bones. They were ours. Skulls, human and otherwise, polished, strung along its frame like a ledger of every season it had ever worked. It wore a mask the color of a gun, with 2 narrow eyes, and over one shoulder it carried a thing I would come to know too well, a slim weapon that swiveled and tracked and woke up with a rising electric whine and a point of light, hunting for a target. The old one drove the young one down into the dirt in front of us. It put a clawed foot on the back of the young one's neck and forced its head to the ground. And then it looked at me, I felt, though I'll never be sure, and it raised the forearm with the twin blades on it, and it let the meaning hang in the dead air so even fools could read it. The young one had broken the law. The law said the young one would die for it, and they had brought it here to the scene of the crime to do it in front of us, because some part of their terrible code required a reckoning to be witnessed by the wronged. I should have let it happen. I want to be honest about that too, because anyone who tells you he felt no part of it is lying. That thing had opened my Junie from shoulder to elbow. I'd spent 11 hours with her blood under my fingernails. There was a man inside me, an old man with a rifle and a long memory, who looked at the young hunter pinned in the dirt and felt nothing but a cold, clean wish to see it ended. But there was someone else inside me too. There usually is in any of us worth the name, and what that someone saw was not a monster. It was a juvenile half-grown that had been sent down into a world it didn't understand to be blooded against worthy prey, and had panicked, and had struck the first warm thing that ran, and had then stood frozen over the wreck of what it had done because some flicker in it knew, the way Junie would have known, the way any of us knew at 8 years old when we'd broken the unbreakable thing. It had not finished her. It could have. It hadn't. And now its own kind were going to open its throat in the dirt, to settle a debt with people it had spent its whole short life being taught to despise. The old one's blade started down. I don't remember deciding. I remember being on the wall, and then I remember being over it in the open ground, in the no-man's dirt between 140 sleeping people, and a clan of the deadliest things our colony had ever known, with my hands up and empty and my rifle left behind on the parapet, because some part of me understood that the rifle was the wrong tool and always had been. I put myself between the blade and the young one's neck. I am not a brave man. I have run from things, but I stood there in the brass dark with my empty hands up, and I said the only word that mattered, the word I'd built a whole second life around after the first one ended in blood. No. The blade stopped. I have wondered every year since what stopped it. I've decided it wasn't mercy on their part and it wasn't fear. I think it was confusion. I think in all the long generations of that clan, across all the worlds they'd hunted, no prey had ever stepped between their law and its sentence. The wronged were supposed to want the reckoning. The wronged were supposed to thirst for it. And here was one of the soft, short, warm-blooded animals they came light years to bleed, putting its own throat under the same blade to keep them from killing the thing that had hurt its young. It made no sense to them. I could feel it making no sense, in the silence that came down, in the stillness of all those unseen watchers. I had broken something in their understanding of what we were. The old one straightened up. It studied me. The narrow eyes of the mask held on me a long time, and then a clawed hand came up and unlatched the mask and lifted it away, and I made myself not look away. Because I'd learned long ago that you do not flinch from a wounded thing you mean to treat, and I'd decided somewhere in the last 10 seconds that this was a wound, and I was going to treat it. The face beneath was a horror, and I held its gaze anyway. The mouthparts worked. It spoke in that layered clicking, a long passage of it, and of course I understood not one sound, but I understood the shape, the way you understand a sentence passed in a language you don't speak. It was telling me the law. It was telling me the young one had failed, had struck the unworthy, had brought shame, and that the price of shame was blood, and that this was not cruelty but order, the thing that had kept their kind clean across more years than my whole species had been standing upright. I let it finish. Then I did the only thing I could think to do, which was to point back over the wall at the dark window where I knew Junie lay sleeping under a clean dressing with her stubborn heart beating, and I shook my head and I said, "She's alive. The child is alive. There's no death to pay for." I don't know how much of it crossed. Maybe none. Maybe it read my hands, my face, the direction of my arm. But the old one went very still, and then it made a single short sound, a different sound, and one of the ghosts came out of the dark carrying something, and laid it on the ground at the edge of the lamplight and withdrew. It was a body. One of theirs, a grown hunter, opened the same clean way they opened us, the spine taken whole, the skull taken clean. And a moment later the ghosts laid down a second shape beside it, smaller, and this one I knew even at that distance, even in that light. Daniel. They had brought him back to us. Whatever else they were, they had not left him in the rocks for the scavenger lizards, and I have never been able to decide whether that was respect or only accounting, and I have stopped needing to know. I understood then the full shape of the thing I was standing in the middle of. Daniel had gone up into the dark and found one of them, and slow to anger and terrible once it came, the fence builder had put his slugs into a thing our whole colony believed could not be killed, and he had brought it down before it brought him down. There was a real death in their ledger now. A grown hunter, dead on the dirt, and their law did not care in the slightest that grief had driven the hand that did it. Their law was older and simpler than grief. The young one had broken the code by striking the unworthy, by cutting a child instead of taking worthy prey, and that dishonor alone had been enough to condemn it. But a clan does not come down out of the haze in full to witness a reckoning over a single failed hunt. They had come because the dishonor and the death together demanded an answer, and they had dragged the young one to the foot of our wall to pay for all of it at once, its own shame, and the blood the disaster of it had cost them. This was harder. I want to be honest. It is one thing to stay in execution when no one has truly died. It is another to stand between a grieving clan and the cause of their grief and tell them, with your empty hands, that they may not have the only justice their world has ever offered them. I felt the ground go out from under my certainty. Who was I, a short-lived animal on a dust ball at the edge of nowhere, to tell these things that their law was wrong? But I'd buried men under a worse law than theirs. I'd watched my own kind execute their own kind for failing to die on schedule, for being broken by things no one should have to carry, for the crime of being young and frightened and in the wrong place. I knew that law from the inside, and I'd spent 11 years out on the rim precisely so I would never have to serve it again. So I knelt down. Slowly, the way you move around a spooked animal, I knelt in the dirt beside the young hunter, who was still pinned, still trembling, that broken clicking going on, and I put my hand on the back of its neck where the old one's foot had been, not to hold it down but to steady it, the way I'd steadied 1,000 frightened bodies on 1,000 bad nights. And I looked up at the old one and I said, "I'll answer for it." I didn't fully mean it as the offer it became. I meant something closer to, take me instead if a body has to pay. But what the old one heard, what they all heard, I think, was a thing that did not exist in their law, a creature offering to take the weight of another's failure onto itself, not because the failed one was strong or worthy or kin. The young one was none of those things to me. I owed it nothing. It had nearly killed the dearest small life in my whole world. And I knelt in the dirt and offered to stand its debt anyway, because the alternative was watching one more frightened child get opened up to satisfy a law, and I was done. I was so completely done with watching that. That was the thing they had no answer for. You hear it said that you beat the hunters with strength, or with cunning, or with a bigger gun. I've heard the stories told that way around our own fires since, the brave settler who outshot the ghosts, and I let people tell it how they like. But that isn't what happened on the dirt outside Coldwater in the dead of the still season. There was no gun that night that would have mattered. They could have ended every soul in that basin before sunrise and lost no one. Strength was never the language. Cunning would have got me killed. What stopped the blade, what I think had never once been put in front of that clan in all its long murdering history, was a thing the apex hunters of the known dark had cut entirely out of themselves on purpose, long ago, because it had looked to them like weakness. Mercy, the deliberate, stubborn, ruinous human refusal to let a helpless thing be destroyed when destroying it would have been easier, cleaner, and within the law. We are not stronger than them. We were never going to be stronger than them. But we will lie down in the dirt over a thing that hurt us and dare the universe to come through us to get to it. and that is a kind of strength they had thrown away. And standing over me in the brass dark, I think the old one knew it, and I think it grieved the loss of it in some way I will never be able to map. For a long time nothing happened. The young one's clicking slowed. My knees went numb in the cold dirt under the dead-hot air. Out in the dark, 140 people held their breath. Then the old one reached down, and I made myself not move, and it took the young hunter by the back of the neck where my hand had been, and it lifted the half-grown thing up onto its feet, and it shoved it, not gently, back toward the dark and the rocks and whatever waited up in the haze. A reprieve, not a pardon. There is a difference, and I think they all felt it. The young one stumbled away and stopped once at the edge of the lamplight and turned its frightened, not quite finished face back toward me, and made a sound I had not heard it make, a single soft note with no break in it, and then the dark took it. The old one was the last to go. It stood over me a while longer. Then it did a thing I have spent the rest of my life turning over. It reached to its own frame, to that ledger of skulls and trophies, and it worked something loose, and it dropped it in the dirt in front of my knees. Then it put the gun-colored mask back over its terrible face, and the light folded around it, and the wrongness moved off across the basin, and the warmth-seeing eyes withdrew from the dark one by one, and the dogs began, tentatively, to breathe again. What it left me was a blade, one of the long curved ones they carry, old, the metal of it nothing our smiths could name, the grip worn to the shape of a hand that was not a hand. I've been told since by people who study such things that it must have been a thing of great meaning to give, that among hunters a weapon passed from the old to another is the highest mark there is, a thing given only between those judged worthy. I don't know about worthy. I know what I think it meant. I think it meant, we see you. I think it meant, you are a kind of thing we did not know was out here, and we will remember it. I think, in the only language they had for respect, it meant the closest their kind could come to an apology, and to a thank you, and to a question they would carry back up into the dark and chew on for 100 years. We buried Daniel 3 days later, when the still season finally broke and the air moved again, and we could be sure of being left alone long enough to dig. I will not pretend the whole settlement understood what I had done at the wall. Some of them did not speak to me for a long while after, and a few never truly did again, and I cannot stand here and tell you they were wrong. Daniel had a marker in the ground now and a daughter who would grow up without him, and the thing that started all of it was still alive, up in the rocks, breathing the same dead air I was. There is an arithmetic that says I traded a good man's justice for a monster's life, and I have done that arithmetic myself on the bad nights, more times than I would like to admit, and it does not always come out the way I'd want. Tessa came to see me the week after the burial. I braced for it. She had lost a husband to that dark and then watched me kneel in the dirt to spare the kin of the thing that took him, and if she had crossed the room and struck me, I would have stood and let her. She didn't. She sat down across from me in the surgery where I'd brought her daughter into the world, and then dragged her back out of death, and she was quiet for a long time, and then she said that Daniel had died doing the only thing his heart would let him do, and that she could not find it in herself to hate me for doing the only thing mine would let me do, even though the two things had stood on opposite sides of the same blade. Then she asked me to keep an eye on Junie when she herself was gone, which is a thing I did not understand the full weight of until years later, and which I have honored every day since. That was Tessa. There was iron in that family the rocks could never break, and the girl came by her stubbornness honestly, from both sides. They never hunted Coldwater again. Not that season, not any season after. The still seasons came and the brass haze sat low over the ridges and we counted the children and trimmed the lamps out of an old habit that had become a kind of prayer, but the ghosts did not come down. Other settlements lost people out across the basin in the years that followed. We never did. I used to think it was luck. I don't anymore. I think we were marked. I think somewhere in whatever passes for their records there is a notation against this dust ball and this basin. A line that says, in clicks and growls I'll never hear, leave these ones. There is something here we do not understand and do not wish to break. Junie kept the arm. She carries the scar of it still, shoulder to elbow, a pale clean line, and she's a grown woman now with children of her own and a stubbornness that has not softened 1 degree with age. When she was small, she used to ask me to tell her the story of the night the ghost cut her, and I'd tell it carefully, leaving the worst out, the way you do. But she grew up sharp, my Junie, and one night when she was grown she asked me the real question, the one under all the others. She asked me why I'd stepped in front of the blade. Why, after what it did to her, I'd knelt in the dirt and offered to pay its debt with my own neck. She asked it not as an accusation, but as a daughter asks a thing she needs to understand before she can carry it forward, and I owed her a true answer, so I gave her the only one I had. I told her that the thing that had hurt her was young and frightened, and had made a child's mistake in a world it didn't understand, and that I had spent the first half of my life watching the young and frightened get destroyed by laws that called their destruction order, and that I had decided, somewhere in a field tent that smelled of copper, that if I lived I would not stand by for it again, not for one of mine, and not for one of theirs, and not for one of anything's. I told her that mercy is not the thing you give to the deserving, because the deserving don't need it. Mercy is the thing you give to the one who hurt you, when hurting it back would be easy and clean and within your rights, and you choose not to, because you have decided what kind of creature you are going to be. I told her that the hunters were stronger than us in every way that could be measured, and faster, and crueler, and older, and that we beat them anyway on the night they came for the young one, and that we beat them with the one weapon they had thrown away and we had not, the one thing in all the long dark that was ours and only ours. The blade hangs over my door. I never learned to use it, and I never will. I keep it there for the same reason I keep telling this story, which is that I am old now, an old man in a chair the way I always wanted to be, and someday soon I'll go up into the still season for the last time and not come back down. And I want it remembered after I'm gone, what kind of thing a human being can be when the law says kill and the easy road says kill, and the whole hard universe is leaning on the blade. I want it remembered that one of us, just once on a dust ball at the edge of nowhere, put his empty hands up in the dead heat and said no, and that the deadliest things in all the dark stopped and listened, and went home changed.